word trauma used in many different contexts. For instance, when there is loss, there is illness, there is accident, there is, grief. But what actually is trauma, and how many types of trauma are there, and what can be done to address trauma? Trauma is any event or a series of events or incidents that leaves the person who is experiencing that event or that incident, that experience, with a high emotional charge. Meaning that it causes an unprecedented amount of anxiety or fear or negative emotions. So there are three types of traumas. There is acute trauma, which usually results from a single incident. Chronic trauma that results from repeated and prolonged exposure to things like domestic violence or abuse. And complex trauma, which is multiple traumas happening over a prolonged period of time. And among the signs and symptoms of trauma are flashbacks or intrusive thoughts of the event or images of the event that has happened, loss of memory and concentration, anxiety, depression, mood swings, disorientation, and so on. So what exactly do therapists mean when they say that the trauma needs to be processed? So to better explain that, think of the brain as divided in two parts. As a very simplistic explanation, you have your logical brain or your thinking brain, and then you have your emotional brain or the feeling brain. And think of memories as a filing system. So you have this filing cabinet in which you have two sections, and one section is for adaptive memories and the other section is for your dysfunctional memories. So your everyday memories, regular memories, like as simple as, let's say going to school or going to work and such a thing happened, etc., over the past many years, will go into your adaptive filing system, right? So without any problem, without any trouble, they go there and they stay there. And then what happens when something traumatic happens, like let's say an accident where there are maybe feelings of intense fear or stress or anxiety, emotionally charged memories, they go into the dysfunctional or non-adaptive filing system. So what happens to the memories that have been stored as dysfunctional memories in the other file of the memory filing system is that they are not processed in the thinking or the rational brain. And they are stored as sensations and as images within the emotional brain. So you're not able to rationalize or contextualize the trauma that happened, let's say, many, many years ago. So what happens is that those memories, they come back as if that trauma is still happening in real time. So they come back as flashbacks, as intrusive images, and cause the same kind of emotional charge, which may be anxiety or fear, or disorientation and loss of concentration and so on and so forth. The way to address trauma or to process trauma is to tap into those traumatic memories and sort of create a bridge between the emotional and the thinking brain, in order to contextualize that trauma, in order to rationalize that trauma, in order to understand that trauma better. So to give that trauma a timeline, meaning that you put that trauma, you create a distance between yourself, your present, and the past when the trauma happened. Trauma can occur at any age. In fact, the traumas that happen before the age of 5 are some of the most damaging types because they actually alter the chemistry of the brain. The more prolonged the trauma, the more chronic the trauma, the more damage to the neurological system. And this has long-term implications for the mental health of the individual because trauma is not bound by time. So it is essential to process trauma. Just to give you an example, a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old Let's say they get lost in a mall or get separated from their parents for 10 to 15 minutes and they experience overwhelming fear. Now, that child at that point in time may be going through some very strong emotions. Some kids are resilient and may not experience the same intensity of emotions. But for this child, that event at that point may be traumatic and get stored or lodged in the emotional brain and not in the thinking brain. So it is possible that that trauma will have some long-term implications and may come up many, many years later in the child's life, and therefore has to be processed. Trauma is very subjective as well. So for instance, what may appear or be traumatic to me may not necessarily be traumatic to, let's say, my sister, right? It all depends on who we are, how we perceive events, how resilient we are. Everyone is different and will internalize things differently. So the best way to treat trauma or to process trauma is through mind and body based approaches. Because remember, if you are only targeting the thinking brain through talk therapy, through verbal therapy, you are never actually going to access the trauma which is lodged in the emotional brain, in the feeling brain. So the way to reach the trauma is through mind-body approaches that tap into the emotional brain. And one of them could be art therapy or play therapy or drama therapy or any of these creative mind-body based approaches where the trauma is accessed through sensations and through images. And then this bridge is created between the emotional and the thinking brain where the trauma can then be rationalized and it can be understood better. So any kind of traumatic event should not be taken lightly and ideally should be addressed through mind-body based approaches.